UK. Okay. And I'm Jonathan Zittrain from the OII, and am very pleased to introduce my friend Susan Crawford. Susan is a graduate of Yale University, summa cum laude. She ended up as a lawyer, as happens to sometimes the best of us, and became a partner at Wilmer Cutler Pickering in Washington, D.C., one of the premier law firms there. And she, and at times the firm, specialized in information technology law, some elements of corporate law. She was part of the team at Wilmer Cutler that assisted in the formation of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. Susan knows more than most people should about the domain name system. At that time, Wilmer Cutler was working for Network Solutions, which was and is the incumbent registrar of names in .com and .net. And most recently, Susan serves on the board of ICANN, so no doubt has some interesting stories to tell about that. She left private practice in order to join academia and is now an assistant professor of law at Cardozo Law School in New York City. And there she's written and is writing on privacy, on intellectual property, and on telecommunications law and regulation, in particular staring into the crystal ball and trying to say where the Federal Communications Commission is going next. And we thought it might be particularly interesting to juxtapose what's happening in the US context with what's happening with Ofcom here in the UK. Susan is also the person who came up with the idea of One Web Day, a sort of digital counterpart to Earth Day, about which I hope she will say more. You have plenty of time to prepare. I don't think it's till the autumn. So Earth Day is in the spring, Digital Silicon Day is in the autumn, and we'll have to come up with something for the solstices as well. Or is it the equinoxes? I always forget. I think it's the solstices. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. It's really terrific, and we do need to talk about mixing taps, but otherwise my visit's been entirely pleasant. And I'm particularly pleased to be here at the OII, which is making such progress and having such interesting programs. I'm really pleased to be part of it. I'm here today to talk to you about two contrasting views of the Internet and two views of government, and the way in which these views are clashing right now in a manner that's having a tremendous impact on the future of the Internet, or will, depending on which route we choose to follow. All of these tensions are playing out richly domestically in the United States and also internationally, so the ICANN context is relevant here too. I just finished reading a slim novel by Anthony Trollope, and you may say, well, there are no slim novels by Anthony Trollope, and you would be right, usually, but this one's slim because he gives away the secret at the beginning of the book, rather than waiting for hundreds and hundreds of pages to reveal it. And he also forgoes the 5 or 6 thinly plotted subplots he usually uses. He has one, it's about the victory of young love at the very end, but it almost doesn't matter. So he gives away the secret, gets away with no subplots, and I'm going to do the same thing. Because I want to have I think the Trollope novel, it's Dr. Wortle's School, is actually better because he worked so hard at thinning things down. And he wrote it in 3 weeks. If only we could write law review articles in 3 weeks, that would be great. So here is the secret of this talk. The secret is that communications regulation in the US is deeply political. I cannot overemphasize how political it is. Quite short-sighted and driven by incumbents of various kinds. Not only the telcos, but also law enforcement in Hollywood are having a tremendous influence on FCC policymaking right now. My personal view is that this approach is leading the U.S. into darkness in the field of telecommunications regulation, or at the very least, we're missing great opportunities for both economic growth and human development. And we're at risk of plunging ahead, and of course, we think we lead the world, so we may be leading the world in this direction too, and I'd be very interested to hear from the Ofcom folks when they get here about the contrast between what the U.S. is doing and what else is going on. So there are two views of the Internet that lie behind all of this. This is the famous duck-rabbit. You have to play with yourself and say, is this a duck or is it a rabbit?
What's the answer?
What is the answer? Well, Jonathan, what do you think? You're pretty brave. Yeah. What do you see?
I go for duck, but only because the rabbit is looking up otherwise.
It's a very optimistic rabbit, yeah. And two sets of people look at the Internet, same facts, and see two radically different things. When a telco or a bellhead sees the internet, they see three chunks. I've heard them do this in many talks, that the internet is the last mile, the connection to the consumer, the backbone, and whatever content providers need is a connection up to the backbone. That is the internet, the wires.
Do we have the phrase bellhead here? People know what a bellhead is?
Oh,
You should tell them what a bellhead is.
sorry. A bellhead is someone from the American tradition of Ma Bell, the great monopoly that was supposedly broken up in 1984 but has reformed in the U.S. We've got 4 of the old baby bells together again, controlling most of the telco market in the U.S. So a bellhead is someone who comes from the telephone circuit-switched tradition. And it really is a mindset, and I keep bumping into it all over the world. It's a different way of thinking about networks. And think about a telephone. The telephone network is optimized. The hardware is optimized to work with a particular service, which is telephone calls, built that way. And hardware and software are inextricably intertwined. Quality of service is always assured. You know what you're getting, and you've built the network for that particular service. The carrier is always paid for the communications that are going over that network and can control and monetize things and has control over what new services are introduced. When's the last time a new telephone service was introduced? You ask yourself. Call waiting, conference calls, there aren't that many of them. But in order to introduce a new telephone system, you've got to reach deep into the central authority and the switches. Hello. Hi.
Welcome.
Come on in. I'm sorry. We began, but only just briefly.
That's fine.
Would you like to take a flanking set of seats here?
It's not a battle move.
Yes. And why don't we pause for
Yes,
a moment
pause.
just to do introductions. Meet Professor Susan Crawford.
Hello.
Hi,
Hi.
nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
And
Hi, I'm Clive Carter. I'm with Ofcom in the strategy development team.
Hello. Sorry the trains got in your way today.
Right.
And I'm Chinyere Wamura. I'm head of telecoms technology within
Well, welcome, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys are up to because I'm about to tell a slightly dark story of what's going on in the United States. Okay? So, and I'm starting with 2 probably overstated views of the internet with 2 different mindsets. One, the bellhead or traditional telephone mindset, which carries forward these points on the screen. You know what service levels you're getting, you control the services, everything not permitted is prohibited. That's the central view of someone who runs a telephone network. It's safe and secure. In fact, the internet, from the view of a traditional bellhead, really doesn't work because there's no guaranteed quality of service. Packets just get there when they get there in a packet switch network. And the network has value for a bellhead, at least in part because it keeps us safe. This is a very old, primordial part of a bellhead's cognitive way of looking at the internet. Here's a very old ad from the 30s from the Bell Telephone Company saying, "Sleep soundly, little lady, mother and daddy are near," and the telephone is always close by. It doesn't go to sleep. All through the night it stands guard over you and millions of other little girls and boys. There's another ad that I don't have here, but I want to tell you about it, from the 20s. "My heart stood still. I heard stealthy voices, someone tinkering with a lock, a muffled footstep. Saw a shadow flit by my window. I reached over to the stand by the bedside and seized, no, not a revolver, a telephone." How about that? That's pretty good. And here's another one. There's an anxious maiden peering out the window, clutching the throat of her nightdress, saying, "When you need a neighbor or a doctor or assistance of any sort, a reliable telephone is a friend in need." So safety is a central marketing message of the early Bell telephones and still something really important to the telephone circuit-switched culture. More seriously, on March 17th, 2006, our FCC opened a new bureau. And the new bureau is titled the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau within the FCC. And they're going to handle public safety communications, 911 service, alert and warning of U.S. citizens, network security, network reliability, and resiliency, a really quite broad mandate. And there has been talk over the years of the FCC becoming part of the Department of Homeland Security. Because communications infrastructure is so important to the country that it should be a national defense matter, not necessarily something left to an independent agency. So that, overly broadly stated, is a picture of the nethead's view of a bellhead's view of the network, optimized for particular services, great control and safety built in, and really central to American life. Now, a nethead has quite different set of views. The network for a nethead is something that just delivers packets. It's independent of the application layer. It could be fiber optic, it could be wires, it could be satellite. Doesn't matter. The pipe is just a pipe, and the pipe is dumb. The intelligence for the network, the operation of the protocols, happens at the edges, not in the center. Everything not prohibited is permitted, in a sense, for a nethead. Any new application can be introduced without permission from any central authority. You could have an internet using carrier pigeons. It would be slow, but you could do it. So although Bellhead might and does think of the internet as these three physical connections, the backbone, the last mile, and the content provider's connection to the backbone, the nethead thinks of the internet as nothing but standards and relationships, the TCP/IP protocol giving rise to all kinds of complex adaptive systems of social relationships on top of the network architecture. It's a deeply social world, although it's made up of machines. And no one is in charge. It's a central part of the nethead mindset. The end-to-end idea behind the network architecture allows anything to happen without anybody needing to be asked. Quality of service, the key issue for a bellhead, for a nethead can be provided by increased bandwidth, just getting more bits to the ends, or special arrangements with private intermediaries like Akamai, who can cache things closer to the users you're trying to reach. So netheads like end-to-end design and keeping the stupid network stupid. Overstating, but it gives us a sense of these two views which are now pushing forward with different levels of success in domestic and international policy. The bellheads are seeking new laws, new institutions, and new asymmetries of information to address the internet, and they are succeeding in the U.S. so far. In effect, we're reaching back towards the days of mainframes, when computers were something distant from us, that humans didn't interact with very much themselves, where we were deferential and the computers were behind glass. And all the glory of user-created content, what Yochai Benkler's new book, The Wealth of Networks, talks about, and I urge you all to get a copy of The Wealth of Networks. He's a friend of ours, and it's a wonderful book. All of that is completely out of the conversation for the policymakers and the bellheads. All the elements of internet design, interconnectivity, standards, and the directory function, all three of these elements are under pressure worldwide from this different point of view. The telcos have never liked the internet, or at least in the United States. Maybe it's different here in the UK, but we only got away with the internet in part because AT&T engineers thought it was such a bad idea. They really didn't want to have anything to do with it. They said it was going to be so inefficient. It was really much more about optimized packet switching. They didn't understand that universal interconnection was a goal of the internet as well. And so they thought it was a joke. And so at first they understood that the internet was sort of a plaything, then maybe something that people would buy second lines for. And now they're suddenly understanding what effects it's going to have on their business, and they want to control it. Until very recently, common carriage rules applied to the telco provision of internet access. And by common carriage, a US term, I suppose maybe it's a UK term too, what I mean is that you have to be open to all comers and allow ISPs to connect with you under a tariffed rate. So the telcos were required to interconnect with ISPs and act as a dumb pipe. This has ended as of August 2005, and I'll talk about that. So it's a big change, and a big bellhead pointed change. And the FCC has suddenly begun to see itself as in charge of the internet. Just a few years ago, they posted a history of the internet on their webpage. That was sort of a symbolic move. And they've started leaping in to make rules that so far very much back the bellhead point of view. So just a little doctrine here to start off with. The 1996 Act. The structure of the Act equates technologies with services. So there's a title for cable, there's a title for broadcast, there's a title, a subpart of the Act for telephones. So it's in silos. That's what people call it in the U.S., different divisions based on what kind of media is being used. Another division that's key to the 1996 Telecom Act is that the FCC divides the world into telecommunications services, which are tariffed and subject to these interconnection obligations and universal service obligations. And then on the other side, information services, which not until recently were subject to any requirements at all. And there's a line of decisions going back to the 70s from the FCC separating basic services, tariffed and controlled, from enhanced services. And those enhanced services are what we might call, and do call today, information services. And I've given you the definition here. That's what an information service is, offering a capability for generating, acquiring, storing, transforming. So this is anything. This is anything a computer does, and anything that happens on the internet is potentially an information service. And the structure of the Act, as you can imagine, is under a great deal of pressure. Cable companies and telephone companies are in the same business now, although their obligations are defined in two separate titles of the Act. Voice over Internet Protocol, or VoIP services, are information services under the current structure of the Act, but they're clearly competing with telephone services, which until recently were tariffed. And all kinds of things that we hadn't been thinking before of being under the purview of the FCC, like instant messaging or email or gaming or the domain name system. All of these things are information services under the FCC's definition. So that the siloed nature of the Act is clearly not going to fit the future of conversion here. And the big recent development is Internet Protocol television, IPTV, being provided by phone companies and cable companies. Also, all information services, how do you regulate it? What is it? It's a big mess. So, in 2002, the FCC found that cable modem service was an information service. And because the telecommunications part of it wasn't being sold separately to end users. So they said cable modem service equals information service. This issue went all the way to the Supreme Court, which agreed, and said, by the way, that the Internet is really tricky and should be left to the FCC under its basic authority, its Title I authority, sort of ancillary set of powers. That's the Brand X case, which was decided in June of 2005. The same day as Grokster in the States, but I think Brand X is much more important than Grokster for the future of the Internet, because the Supreme Court has essentially said that FCC does have power over information services, which includes everything running over the Internet. The telcos, learning that the cable companies didn't have any more interconnection obligations and would be able to vertically integrate their businesses, went directly to the FCC and within weeks had a mandate for themselves, adding telephone, broadband, DSL to the list of Title I services. So what this means is for digital subscriber line internet access, no interconnection obligations, no need to allow independent ISPs to use your services, no non-discrimination requirements. You can do whatever you want to with your broadband if you're a telco, and no more tariffing. Now, it used to be that DSL had to unbundle and sell its telecom part off to independent ISPs. That's no longer required. So the important development in June of 2005 is that the Supreme Court has affirmed what the FCC already thought was its authority. And we're into a sort of ad hoc set of rulemakings about Internet information services, because this ancillary Title I doesn't have very many lines in it. It's just whatever the FCC feels is reasonable. And we've already seen quite a bit of evidence of this in the rulemakings I'm going to go over today. So there are lots of interesting questions here about what the FCC is doing. I'm going to deal with just three topics. The open access, non-discrimination requirements for broadband, huge political fight in the US right now over this. The shorthand designator for this argument is net neutrality. I'm going to go over the arguments pro and con that are going on in front of Congress right now. What social policies should be adopted for information services? I'm going to use access to E911 as the example here of a policy that the FCC has lifted from the world of telephony and applied to Internet applications. And then a third topic is law enforcement desires for surveillance involvement with Internet applications, with the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, or CALEA, as the statute being examined. I'm not going to deal with universal service, which is a huge topic all by itself. The U.S. has poured $48 billion into rural telephone subsidies, mostly going to square states in the center of the country. All of the senators from those square states are on the Commerce Committee in the Senate, so they have a lot of power over what happens with telecom policy. It's widely admitted, even by the people who administer the Universal Service Program, that it's a mess, that there's so many cross-subsidies and it's just graft-ridden, money not going to where it needs to go. And it clearly needs to be fixed, but no one can figure out how. It may be that that is actually the most important topic, because following the money is always key for telecommunications regulation. But within the time span of this presentation, I really can't deal with it. But it's clear this is going to be a big issue for the next year. There are constant threats to rewrite the 1996 Act, because as we've discussed, it really doesn't fit the current world. It's under such pressure from so many directions. My personal best hope for 2006 is to not have any harm done, to hope that everybody disagrees so much that we won't try a huge rewrite of the Act. And we only have 60 legislative days remaining, so I have hopes for this. Some have described the Bell companies as glaciers because they're slow to innovate, but once they start, they're nearly impossible to stop. And that's what's going on in Congress today. So let's start with the particular questions here. The open access debate. So back in August 2005, as I mentioned before, the FCC ruled that DSL, like cable modem, is an information service under Title I, so there are no access requirements. And the telcos then made this situation very public by asserting, in effect, that they should have vertical control of their last mile connections to users. They should be able to inspect packets, watch what's going across their networks, and prioritize according to whether they've made a deal with a particular packet source or not. There's some famous quotes from Ed Whitaker about this. He was the former CEO of SPC, he's now at AT&T, saying things like, "Why should they, internet online companies, be allowed to use my pipes? The internet can't be free in that sense because we in the cable companies have made an investment, and for a Google or Yahoo or Vonage or anybody to expect to use these pipes for free is nuts." So Whitaker maybe should have been better controlled by his PR people, because Verizon hadn't said anything like that, and the whole thing might have slid through more easily had these incendiary comments not been made. And although what the telcos seek to do is not particularly clear, and they keep claiming they won't discriminate against internet content, it does look as if they'd like to prioritize packets using some new marking schemes, and because their routers permit inspection of packets, so you can watch what's going across. So they want to prioritize their own bits and those of their partners. Everybody else would just get best efforts service. They've been seeking new laws to bless this treatment of their network, and that's going on in Congress right now. They could easily just do this. They have authority to do it, but they don't want to be sued. So they want to make sure that Congress has blessed the idea of a tiered internet. And investment analysts have showed up in front of Congress saying, if you constrain the telcos' businesses in any way, their stock price is going to plummet. It's going to be a very unstable state for them. It's funny, I was in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago, and the same thing was said by New Zealand stock analysts. If you try to constrain what the telco can do, here the stock market itself will crash because the valuation of this company will be destroyed, and it's such a crucial part of the New Zealand economy. So that's a strong argument for letting the telcos do what they want to do. Telcos point out that no network operates neutrally. Can't think of another one that does this. That sure, there's lots of cooperation online, there's been a tradition of common carriage, but how are they supposed to cover their costs of connecting millions of computers, laying down millions of miles of cable, erecting countless wireless transmitters, making it possible for us to ship a film from Beverly Hills to Bangalore? How can they recoup their investment unless they have control over the networks in this fashion? So yes, go after abusive monopolies, go after deceptive advertising to consumers, but business has always worked this way. This is private property, these networks, and we must be allowed to control them just as anybody else controls their networks of delivery. They also say regulation here will lead to rigidity. It's a very clever argument on their part. Because common carriage has now been blown up in August of '05, to ask for anything is to ask for any neutrality by these networks is to ask for regulation. And they point out that that would mean that the FCC would be reaching deeply into the business models of all of these enormous companies, which can't be good for the evolution of business in the States. So that's the bellhead side. We built this thing. It's almost as if they're standing with rippling muscles. You know, we built it, we own it, and we must be allowed to monetize it, or we'll go out of business and plunge the whole country into depression. Now, the critics have charged that the network providers have every incentive to shape the future of the internet, to act as gateway keepers and intermediaries, to squelch competition by, for example, VoIP providers who are undermining their ability to sell landlines. VoIP, I've got the figures here. VoIP is now 3.5% of phone usage in the U.S. as of January 2006. Vonage is in the lead, then Skype, then AT&T, then Verizon. The Bells, Verizon and AT&T are holding on to their own VoIP services, but they don't want the other guys to cannibalize their existing landline phones.
And Susan, are those figures people who are using voice over internet protocol to terminate calls into the regular telephone system, or does it include conversations that may never cross the threshold of a telephone conversation because now you and I will Skype rather than use the phone?
It's both. People who have replaced, it includes people who have replaced their landline phones with VoIP, and people who are using VoIP as phone service. So the telcos are seeing the number of landlines diminish hugely at this point. They're really losing that marketplace. And apparently the voice quality of VoIP applications is considered by many people to be better than landlines. It's going to go on that way. Now, lots of criticism of the telco desire to control the last mile in the U.S. Concern about application innovation being stifled, so waiting for ex post enforcement is not good enough. Concern that even now investment is not flowing into new applications because of the risk that some telco or cable company will be able to simply block that new application by inspecting packets and prioritizing what goes through. Critics are pointing out that the network providers will be, in effect, determining the market, picking winners and losers by deciding what goes quickly and what goes slowly. I used to live in Washington, and I moved to New York. I could no longer order a sandwich in Washington because it goes too slowly. I stand in line, and we chat, and then maybe they'll ask me if I want a sandwich. You know, in New York, it's terrifying. You have to have your money out, be ready to go, have your whole... And so it really does make a difference how quickly things happen. So if some services are not reaching users, they'll just give up on them. And that's a concern from the innovation point of view in the network neutrality argument. The internet right now has all of these open feedback mechanisms. A provider of a new application will know whether it's popular by the uptake on the other side. If the telcos and cable companies are controlling through payment structures who actually reaches consumers, all of that feedback mechanism will go away, or much of it. And of course, another argument is that the internet is really much more than a content delivery mechanism, that it's supposed to be for interactive applications, not just feeding content, VoIP or television down the line. This conversation is also being driven by broadband. Oh, I don't have a good slide on that one, but I'll talk about it. Poor U.S. performance in terms of penetration of broadband is a huge problem for us. We view it to be anyway. In Japan and Korea and other countries, broadband providers are offering consumers much more bandwidth at lower prices than we have in the U.S. And this is true even in densely populated cities in the U.S. with the same demographic characteristics as places in Asia that are doing much better than we are. We're up to about 74% broadband penetration in the States, with most of the new broadband users being people who've converted from dial-up to broadband. So the telcos have a powerful argument. They can say, if you give us the incentives to invest in our networks, we'll keep doing it. We'll roll out more fiber. We'll make sure that the U.S. does better. Right now, we're sort of next to Slovenia in terms of broadband penetration, and actually Slovenia is doing better as the figures going up. We're just sort of staying constant. Now, of course, the telephone companies in the U.S. have been making this promise for a long time. Back in 2000, They promised, Verizon and SBC said they'd spend $50 billion and have 36.5 million households on hot new broadband systems, and they didn't do it. So I guess the hope is that now these promises mean something and these incentives should be in place for them to be able to do it. Criticism of the telco's plan is also being driven by the fact that the market for broadband services is extraordinarily concentrated in the U.S. We have at most two choices available in most areas, either the cable service or the DSL, or maybe both. And I said that the baby bells keep merging. Well, AT&T is now going to merge with Bell South, and they will control 22% of all consumer dollars spent on telecom services. It's a lot, including video services, and 34% of dollars spent in the business market. So after this deal is closed, 3 of these top telecom providers, AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast, will control almost 50% of the total consumer market. So that's a pretty concentrated market. So highly concentrated market, another concern about absence of neutrality on the networks. None of the big players is interested in offering an unfettered internet. Cable and telcos would like to be able to prioritize bits, make sure that their packets get through more quickly. So it is true that the network providers should have every incentive to take advantage of network externalities, to want to get all the customers they can, and not to block things that might make people unhappy. That's true. But on the other hand, it's also true that they have incentives to restrict access to make sure that they're the first comer. You know, they seize markets in particular areas, and that their profits go up. They're having real trouble in the stock market. And the statements, the Whitaker sort of bellicose statements, really aren't helping in this regard. So half the statements are, well, trust us, we'll never discriminate. And then the other half are, you know, why should you guys be able to use our network? So there's real intensity about this. Now, everybody agrees that the anxiety over this entire subject would diminish if there were more choices of broadband providers, more ways of getting online quickly. And it might be that another network provider will arise that will provide unfettered internet access and make sure that applications providers can travel these networks without interruption. And the possibilities could include wireless broadband or fiber optic networks that ignore the telco's networks. But there are huge upfront costs here to invest to get a third pipe going. And for wireless, we'd need the FCC to make a lot of spectrum available to potential network providers, and they're not particularly good at this. So, although this would reduce the anxiety, not much hope that it's actually going to happen. I find the example of Amsterdam particularly instructive here. It's just fascinating what's going on there. They're about to start on a major fiber-to-the-home project, potentially the largest in Europe, that could reach almost 500,000 homes, cost of 300 million euros. This is all going to be an open access network, absolutely open. And they think they're going to stimulate services innovation and give greater choice to consumers. That's expensive. So far we haven't seen an actor in the US who'd be willing to do this. There's some rumors that Google and others will develop a fancy new wireless network, but we're not sure. People are building municipal broadband networks to avoid the telco strictures on the last mile. And the telcos are actively fighting this. There's a famous example in Pennsylvania. A law was passed that requires phone companies to offer broadband throughout the state by 2015. But it also requires municipalities who want to offer broadband service to first ask the telephone company. First have to go to them and then wait for them to say yes or no before the municipality can do this on their own. So lobbying is intensive on the Bellhead side to make sure that there aren't too many City of Amsterdam-like experiments in the U.S. So far, the FCC, I think it's fair to say, has been aiding the telcos in this pursuit of a monetized last mile. They issued a very weak and completely unenforceable set of principles in August of 2005 about consumer access to lawful applications and devices, with lots of footnotes saying subject to the requirements of network management, which gives a lot of wiggle room to the telcos to do what they want to do. And just last week, or 2 weeks ago, the FCC, by inaction, by sitting still, deregulated Verizon's provision of business lines Verizon has a huge chunk of the business marketplace for broadband in the United States. Now they have no interconnection obligations at all. And the FCC did this without issuing a written order, just by not acting on a forbearance petition that Verizon filed a year ago. One of the commissioners was quite upset about this and filed a big dissent, but it happened. So I think it's fair to say the FCC is helping this. They've been exempted from regulation on their business lines and on consumer DSL. Telcos have contributed mightily to Congress. AT&T now is merged with Bell South and SBC, but kept all three lobbying teams intact in Washington, didn't fire anybody. And they're all working on this issue. So the online companies are sort of late to the game, trying to convince Congress to do something else, but don't have the kind of manpower or funding that the telcos do. The idea of denying access to an application is just about unthinkable to a nethead. So this is a quasi-religious argument. And the two sides are sort of marching past each other in the night. They cannot communicate about this. A nethead could never understand why you would want to optimize a network for particular services. And of course, it's not really about denying access. There are a few telcos who might be so crude as to do this. This has happened in Canada in a few occasions, but it's mostly about traffic shaping, very incremental steps that a telco might or cable company might take to optimize their particular user's experience. Very incremental, but very effective. So I already mentioned Amsterdam. I think there are lots of stories around the world where this is going differently. I'm going to be very interested to hear what's happening here. Same thing in New Zealand. They're laying down fiber, independent fiber, to avoid the telco because the telco provides such bad service and is never going to give broadband access the way they want. Some provinces in India have avoided the local telco with great success. So there's some success stories from the nethead point of view, but mostly bellheads are doing better. Deutsche Telekom, as you may know, wants to have an IP multimedia subsystem, sort of a closed platform in Germany, and the European Union Commission has already said they're not happy about this, that Deutsche Telekom would be able to avoid interconnection and competition this way. So there are lots of ways we could try to fix the open access problem. These are very, very hard questions. If the telco is not going to discriminate, why can't they just say, we're not going to discriminate? But they seem unwilling to do that. And Reed Hunt has suggested, he's a former chair of the FCC, has suggested we should perhaps declare all access networks subject to the old telephone rules, subject to non-discrimination and tariffing rules, and then forbear. Just have that hanging like a sword of Damocles over broadband providers, but not enforce those rules until something bad happened. Speaking of something bad happening, we have really no idea what's going on these networks. Very little neutral information about the experience of a packet crossing any one of these broadband networks. And the telcos are not letting anybody in. So that's another problem. Okay, so my own view, of course, is that we should go towards an open network. I think my bias is obvious here, like a sidewalk, a neutral substrate, something that everything else rides on. And I do think the closed access approach is unprincipled in a variety of ways. I think the FCC really sees its direction as forwarding the goal of autonomous telcos, not having them be subject to the tyranny of the majority. But there should be a larger role for government here to worry about the good of the polity as a whole and our own self-determination and self-governance. That's not happening. So that's just one of my three topics. Let me go on to another one, unless there are questions. That's a big one, and there are thousands of articles about this in the U.S. press right now. Now the second one, another way to avoid competition is to load in heavy-duty regulation, and we've seen this in a couple of areas. I'm afraid the E911 story fits very well here. In March 2004, the FCC initiated a very broad rulemaking called the IP-enabled services rulemaking. Now, it covers any service that's helped by the Internet Protocol. That's everything on the Internet. The domain name system, a newspaper, everything is potentially an IP-enabled service. And they said, sort of in a playful footnote, well, we could tariff online newspapers, or we could, require E911 service of stores online. Okay, we're not going to do that. So they didn't take that step, but they did move very quickly on 911. They were faced with reports of people picking up a Vonage phone, planning to reach a physical call center in their neighborhood with an emergency call and not being able to. And some tragic stories that happened with people dying, children not getting the aid they needed. So they announced, the Commission announced last June, that all interconnected VoIP providers, which means voice applications that are capable of connecting to the traditional telephone system, had to equip their networks with E91 call routing ability by November 28th, 2005, or cut off their customers that didn't have that ability. E911 means that a physical call center gets through a dedicated piece of hardware called the selective router, not only the information that someone is calling, but their location information as well. E stands for enhanced. So you're getting location as well as the telephone number, because often people in distress can't describe where they are or how they can be reached. For this to happen, there's a need for cooperation between the local telephone company that runs these selective routers, this piece of hardware, this dedicated 30-year-old legacy thing that connects to the public service answering points, the call centers. So that local telephone company has to cooperate with the VoIP provider to give them access to that hardware asset. But the FCC didn't mandate any kind of cooperation between the local telephone guys and the VoIP people. So there were a lot of choke points. There's also, it's a fascinating, complicated story. There's a third party in the US who controls 80% of these selective routers. It's called Intrado, large Colorado company. And they're the outsourced provider of emergency services for the bells in the US. And they actually wrote the resulting E91 rule from all the clues I've been able to gather over the course of the year. You can understand why. They understand how it works, and they were looking to benefit their business. Without rules in place to ensure that all these little VoIP guys have access to these selective routers at reasonable costs, new entrants to this market could be and were denied entry into the market. Commission also said it wasn't going to shield interconnected VoIP providers from liability under state laws for any mistakes they made in connection with providing emergency services. By contrast, both the wireless guys and the traditional telephone companies are shielded from liability. I think it's fair to say in the E911 context, the third-party outsourced service provider, Intrado, and the incumbent telephone companies successfully managed to cause the FCC to create a standard that would have put the VoIP providers out of business because nobody could reach this very quick deadline of November 28, 2005. And actually, under pressure from industry and other groups, the FCC quietly let its deadline go and said, you don't have to cut off your customers, but you do have to stop marketing to people who are in areas that will not be reached by E911. What's fascinating about this is that VoIP isn't the only industry still working on 911. More than 10 years ago, the FCC ordered wireless carriers to do this. They're still having trouble implementing 911 because of all these hardware issues in this old legacy system. So about 81 million Americans still live in areas without full E911 access, even in the wireless context. Now, I'm not against emergency services, it's just that there were better ways to do this, and requiring VoIP providers to connect through hardware going into a PSAP, the public service answering point, was not the best way to do it. You could have had internet protocol enabled services that do all kinds of neat things, like showing you a picture of the house or giving health records of the person who's calling. And in fact, applications like that were being worked on by the voice providers, who then dropped all their plans when the FCC dropped this mandate. And so advances that could have been made have not been. And they've put aside their work on more robust emergency response efforts. Because obviously, if the FCC was requiring that you use the 30-year-old system, you couldn't get around that by using the Internet Protocol-enabled system. So even the Commission called this an aggressive strategy. And it was an aggressive strategy, and it didn't work out, in a sense. It was arguably flatly impossible to implement by the independent VoIP providers. Everybody except Vonage. No way they could have done this. And it would have put out of business almost 1 million VoIP subscribers had the FCC stuck to its rule and not backed off in November. So, and for me, the key point is the development of more flexible IP-enabled emergency response services was nipped in the bud. So that's another step the FCC has recently taken, this one with respect to emergency services. And I suspect there's a counterpart to this story here in the UK that I can't wait to hear. One more here. This is CALEA. This is the Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act. Just some background here. There's no question but that everybody in the communications business has to respond to warrants and subpoenas from law enforcement. That's not the question behind the statute. This statute is about whether they have to design their applications or services in order to make tappability easier. That's what CALEA is about. And it's a 1994 statute. It was adopted because law enforcement was worried they wouldn't be able to tap digital telephony easily. So they put in place a mandate that said that telecommunications companies, traditional telephone companies, have to be able to isolate and enable the government to access call identifying information that's reasonably available to the carrier, and then deliver those intercepted communications to the government in a standard format. So CALEA essentially says you've got to capture the right information that we need as law enforcement and then be able to deliver it to us. And this 94 statute authorized the government to pay $500 million to the telcos for their compliance efforts. But the deal behind the 94 statute was that it didn't apply to the internet or to information services. It's very clear, lots of legislative history about this. In fact, the head of the FBI got up in front of Congress and said, gee, I wish we could have a more extensive statute, but we need to get something done, so let's just do it for digital telephony. In August of 2005, the FCC released an order at the request of law enforcement interpreting CALEA to mean that any services provided by non-telephone companies that are in some way, however minor, substitutes for traditional telephone service have to be CALEA compliant. This was a huge step, and this legal interpretation is at best tenuous. Here you've got a statute that expressly carved out information services, this other half of the world, and the FCC is interpreting it to bring those services back in, using this idea of substantial replacement. Law enforcement takes the view that because these services, voice services and broadband access, are relied on by the American public, CALEA should apply to them. And so the order includes within its scope all VoIP applications that are capable of connecting to the traditional telephone network, even if they don't actually connect. And most observers say that there's no principal distinction for this law enforcement desire between VoIP and anything else that people use to communicate, like instant messaging or email. Maybe all of these things should be designed so as to make them easily tappable. And law enforcement made it very clear that it would be a good idea if people developing such services brought them first to the Department of Justice for clearance before they were unleashed on the unsuspecting public via the internet. This is a big flip of the paradigm. This is the everything not permitted is prohibited kind of idea behind the law enforcement things. The other fascinating thing about this rulemaking is that the FCC said you've got to comply by May 2007 or fines $10,000 a day, but didn't say what compliance meant. So it's this sort of strange mandate that puts a huge category of internet services under a cloud of perhaps needing to be pre-approved by the Department of Justice without knowing what they need to do in advance. Creates enormous risks for them because if they put out applications that are deemed in the future to be deficient by law enforcement, they'll have to yank these things off the market, make them unavailable, or retrofit them, which will be enormously expensive. So the CALEA order is being challenged on statutory grounds. I think it's easy to say, and I think it's true, that it's driven by a bellhead mentality. Things should be safe, things should be surveilled, and services should have permission before they run, but that's not the internet mindset. And there are important law enforcement objectives behind CALEA. And in fact, the American public seems quite happy with surveillance of all kinds. But it's the pre-approval part of this that, like E911, is not the best way to do it. There are other ways to get law enforcement the data they need. In fact, they seem capable of getting everything at a moment's notice without permission from anybody. So just go ahead and get it, but don't force people to design their applications to your mandates in advance. There may be even more tension in the future over this as people move more and more to peer-to-peer technologies, which are good for users, very efficient, but not so good for law enforcement or Disney. On the Disney point, fascinating thing happened here. Disney was a big proponent of network neutrality 3 years ago, making speeches, joining coalitions. Recently, they came out against network neutrality, and the rumor is that they've made a deal with the telcos to make sure that peer-to-peer applications are outlawed in the newly controlled networks. Now, maybe that's just black helicopters, but it's possible to believe anything in this environment, and that their flip seems very strange, because as a content company, you'd think you'd want neutrality. Okay, so I'm coming to the end here. You'd think in the US that we're going back to the mainframe era, this sort of centralized idea. We won't be uploading, we'll just be downloading, and intermediaries are being pressured enormously. There's a lot of work on new laws, new institution, and new asymmetries of information in these three key internet areas: interconnection, standards, and the directory function. Certainly looking for new laws for required surveillance gateways, perhaps making the FCC part of the Department of Justice in the future. New asymmetries of information like widespread surveillance. In the standards area, a lot of work on CALEA and E911. These are all new things that the internet hasn't seen before. And there'll be many more. These are just the first two. There'll be lots more efforts along these lines. New institutions. Here I've put down the ITU Next Generation Networks work on standards. In effect, seeing the internet as a mobile phone system and making it much like sort of mobile phone where everything is controlled and authorized, and sort of mobile phone plus cable television. And work on the next generation network standard setting activities going on around the world. There are lots and lots of meetings about this. And members of the entrepreneurial legal intercept community, self-identified, someone left a comment on my blog talking about the entrepreneurial legal intercept community, are very much part of this, as is Cisco, these vendors that would like to be providing surveillance systems. New asymmetries of information. I just put Geneva. That's my American knee-jerk thing. How do I know what's going on in Geneva? What are you guys doing? Directory service. I could talk about this, but I've rambled on too long. Just new laws. I'm worried about the U.S. relationship with ICANN. ICANN really is the nethead way of governance, supposed to be consensus, bottom-up development of rules, and was formed to keep governments at bay. But my own government is beginning to act in kind of a heavy-handed way, saying, we're in charge of ICANN, don't create .XXX. Someone should be in charge of this thing, the internet. And we think it's us, and I think it's a very negative development. New institutions in the directory function. As you may know, there's a lot of pressure from the ITU to be running ICANN, to have governments involved in the domain name system, and that's sort of proceeding ahead. And new asymmetries of information. Instead of something like the IETF or ICANN making standards, that'll be over. We'll be doing things at the ITU. So I put this in here because these French students are looking for a controlled future, you could argue. They're hoping for jobs forever. I don't agree with that, but I do agree that they should have that sidewalk to demonstrate on. And that's what the internet should be, this neutral substrate that allows all kinds of flourishing activity should happen. I think our government, and I hope other governments, needs to take an active role in maintaining the neutrality of that substrate. Because we've otherwise got this risk. A lot of nannies telling us what to do with internet technology and putting our future at enormous risk. So that's it, and I look forward very much to hearing what's going on in the UK. Thanks.